Bom dia! That means good morning in Portuguese. I'm Mrs. Longcor. I teach third grade at Model, so you might recognize me from the hallway. I'm just here to talk a little bit about my experience in other cultures. So when I was in kindergarten, my parents decided to become missionaries to Brazil. So we went down the first time when I was in kindergarten for about a year. I don't remember a ton from that. I remember bits and pieces. The big things I remember from that trip were it's really hot in Brazil all the time. Christmas, it's still hot. It's just rainy. Lots of bugs and insects and snakes and animals. And I loved the food from Brazil. Lots of fruits, lots of meat, lots of rice and beans. So those were the things I remember when I was in kindergarten. Fast forward some years, we went back to Brazil when I was in 6th and 7th grade. So I was just a little bit older than you are now. And this is where I learned a lot about Brazilian culture and experiencing what it's like to experience a new culture. So I'm going to spend a lot of time just talking about my experience. And then if you guys have any questions, just tell your teachers and I can either come in or I can get you some more answers for those questions. So when I went to Brazil the second time in 6th grade, my parents we went to Manaus to learn the language, Portuguese. And Manaus is a city, and so the roads were paved, they had buses, they had bicycles, lots of motorcycles, some cars, not as many cars, and the buildings were concrete buildings. There were wealthier people that lived in the city, but there were a lot of poor people as well. Lots of poverty, lots of people living in shacks. Think about the billboard signs. They made their houses with those. And so there was a very big gap between people who had money and could afford houses, and then there were people who just lived in poverty and didn't have hardly anything. So that was a very big eye-opening experience for me, just to witness how poor people were in other countries and that their government didn't do anything to help them. So when we went to learn the language in Manaus, my parents put us in a Portuguese-speaking school. So first day of 6th grade, I go in and no one in my class knew any English. They all spoke Portuguese. That was the biggest experience for me. I still remember I go in and I was the only one in my family who didn't have anyone knowing any English. My teacher didn't know English. My classmates didn't know English. And I just remember going in and thinking, what am I going to do? I can't understand anything that's going on. And after a few minutes of this realization, I was already nervous to begin with. When you go to a new place, you're always nervous anyway, and the fact I couldn't understand anyone and I couldn't communicate, I started crying. I cried a lot that first day. Luckily, I had some great friends in that room, and they communicated with me in lots of other ways that wasn't speaking. They spoke, but they also pointed, or they showed me. They drew a lot of pictures for me to help me understand and figure things out. And I went along with it. I did my best to communicate, and pretty soon I started understanding Portuguese. And then a little bit later, I would start to speak Portuguese. And then before I knew it, I was speaking Portuguese just like I had known it. So it was really cool just to learn a new language. But that was probably the biggest barrier for me going into a new culture, was the language barrier and not being able to communicate for a long time. It was a long time, but once I was able to go over that barrier, it was really rewarding. So I'm glad I stuck with it. Let's see, some of the differences in cultures that I picked up on were, it kind of has to do with the poverty. Just they were very thankful for everything they had. because they didn't have very much. So everything was a big deal. If you think about all the things you have, like your iPads, your TVs, you have lots of technology, or maybe you don't. Clothing, and it was just everything that they had was important to them because they didn't have a ton. But on the other hand, those things weren't the most important thing for them. Time was a very big difference. Here in America, I feel like we run our world on time. Everything, we have a schedule. We have school these hours, we have, practices certain times, we have just time. We have 15 minutes to do this, and we have 30 minutes to do this. In Brazil, time was a little bit looser of a concept. Yes, we had school for a certain amount of hours, but then, like, if you said, hey, come over to my house, and I would ask them what time, it was kind of like, oh, this afternoon. It wasn't like a specific time. It was kind of like, oh, come when you can, and stay for however long you can. I was just kind of shocked that if I said, hey, come over to my house at 6 o'clock, people wouldn't show up until 7 o'clock. But it was perfectly normal for them to not come right at the time I told them to. And they would stay longer than I thought they would, too. And it was just, they were enjoying being in the moment and not worried about time. So that, I feel like, was a big difference in the cultures as well. So we lived in two different places. So that when we were learning the language, it was Manaus in the more of a city area. They called it a barrio. And then once we learned Portuguese, we moved upriver. So we took a boat along the Amazon River to our new living place called Benjamin Constant. And you had to take a boat to get to this place, and it was so different. So even in one country, there was a lot of differences. And this city that we lived in was all grass. Dirt roads, grass. The buildings were different and spread out. The houses were made of wood. The shutters, or the windows, we had screens to keep the bugs out, but then there was a shutter, and we had to use a little rope to pull the shutter open so the breeze could come in, and then either at night or when we were leaving, we had to put the rope back down and the shutter would close, and then we'd lock it so that people couldn't come in. And that was a really big difference. Another big difference was the water system. So in the city, we used some well water. We were fortunate enough to get well water. But when we lived in Benjamin Constant, our water came from the rain. So whenever it rained a lot in Brazil, but the rain would come down, and on the top of our house, it would catch the rain and put it into a basin, and it would be like a water container that sat on top of our house. And so when we showered with rainwater, and when we washed dishes with the rainwater. And if we needed a drink, we would take that rainwater and we had a filter, and then we also had to boil it so that it would kill all the germs and things in it. And so that was a big process just to be able to drink water. It took a lot of time to get the water clean so we could drink it. So that was a really big difference. Let's see. Just living on the Amazon River was cool. There's lots of animals. The missionary that lived next to us had a pet monkey, so you don't get to see that every day, and that was really cool. Lots and lots of animals in Brazil. Big spiders. The other thing was the sewer system. It runs along both places. So in the city, it would run along the street, and in the Benjamin Constant, it was in ditches usually around. So here in America, we have the sewer system underneath the ground, and in Brazil, it was running right along in the streets. So that was a big difference. One of the other things I want to talk about is just what skills you need to survive or thrive in another culture. So knowing that there are differences and that it's okay to be different was a big skill you needed to know. Like, you know that it's going to be different and there are reasons for that. And understanding that was really important, because if I went in with the mindset of, this is not how we did it in America, oh no, I can't do it, I wouldn't have gotten very far. Just embracing the culture, trying new things. I learned to love different foods from Brazil. Love them. If I didn't try them, I would have never known. Yeah, it looked a lot different. Some of the stuff looked kind of questionable. And I tried it and it was great. And then also not being afraid to try new things. I did lots of activities. I loved playing soccer, and they taught me how to play barefoot soccer in Brazil, and I was on their team and got to experience that culture. And I went to camp when I was in Brazil, and same things. Like, I just tried new things, and it was different. At camp, we didn't have bunk beds, we didn't have air mattresses, we hung hammocks, and I slept in a hammock for a week. I survived. It was okay. Different, definitely. I didn't think it was as comfortable as a bed, but I got to experience that culture and just embrace the differences. So I had a great time in Brazil. I made a lot of friendships. I even still have some Facebook friends that friendships from Brazil. And it really opened my eyes to how fortunate some of us are in America and how different and privileged sometimes we are in America. And it just opened my eyes to a love for other cultures and learning about new cultures. So I'm really glad I had that experience, and I definitely want to go back to Brazil sometime just to visit and see what has changed since I've been there. So yeah, I am going to leave you with a little Portuguese phrase. Obrigada por ouvir. Espero que você tenha aprendido algo novo. Which means, thanks for listening. I hope you learned something new. And if you guys have any questions for me, feel free to ask your teachers and they'll get me those questions, or maybe I can stop in sometime or stop me in the hallway and you can ask me some questions. So I hope you do great on this next project, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.